We're back. You're listening to the Talkin Boxing with Billy C show. Glad you could join us. And I want to give a shout out to ESPN New Hampshire. Glad that we're part of your programming today. And listen, do not forget, have you gotten your copy of the Tom Molyneux From Bondage to Baddest Man on the Planet yet? No? What the hell are you waiting for? There's a great read, man. Everybody should get a copy, or 2 or 3 or 5. I think everyone should buy a dozen of them because it make great Christmas gifts. It'll fit right into the stockings for all your favorite peoples. So get yourself a copy of the Tom Molyneux book. It's available where all good books are sold. And you can get it online right now at Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com. If you're looking for a signed copy, visit our website, www.billycboxing.com, and click on the Billy C Book Club section, which is on the left-hand side, and it'll show you some instructions on how to get a signed copy. But right now, it's that time again.
Blast from the past. We shine the spotlight again on fighters from years past.
Top-ranking heavyweight. Joe Louis is the leading contender.
Joe Frazier with a left hook. Good right hand thrown by Foreman that time.
Look at that left hook. Belt that goes to Ray Mancini. It's Blast from the Past on Talkin Boxing.
This week's Blast from the Past, which is being sponsored by KOFantasyBoxing.com. Check it out, www.KOFantasyBoxing.com. Features, upon popular demand, former world heavyweight champ Tommy the Duke Morrison. A lot of you guys are requesting us to do a blast on Tommy the Duke, and we aim to please here on the Talkin Boxing with Billy C show. And joining me right now to tell us all about the Duke, no, maybe not that Duke, let's just stick to Tommy Morrison, is my man Alex Perpali. What's up, brother?
Good evening, Billy C. There's actually a connection to that Duke.
Actually, there may not be, and I'll get to that a little bit later. But tell us about Tommy the Duke.
Yes, Tommy the Duke Morrison. He was born January 2nd, 1962, in Gravette, Arkansas. A lot of the press that I see, that was part of the marketing of him, was that he was the great grandnephew of John Wayne.
Well, wait, let me.
I know. Hold on a second. I know you have a lot of firsthand info, so I will. How about if we do it this way? That I put out the stuff I have, and then you do the corrections, because I know that's the thing about him. That's he's a controversial guy because so much about him was denial. So even he wasn't, even he wasn't telling the truth about things.
Well, I wasn't. He never told me. That wasn't firsthand. I'm gonna tell you. But you know what? I have him listed as being born in 1969, January 2nd, 1969, not 62.
I said 62. I'm sorry. I read 60. I was looking at 69. Yeah,
oh, okay. All right. No, because sometimes you listen. You know, a lot of times with maybe not with more of a modern guy like Tommy Morrison, but a lot of times those birth dates are unknown with the blast from the past. You know, so and I've come up several times where you have even a birthplace might be different than what I have, and that's what makes it even more interesting sometimes. But I have a comment from. John Wayne's son, Patrick Wayne, and he was asked in an interview at the height of Tommy Morrison's career, and he said, I don't really think or know if he's related to us or not. However, if the guy keeps winning, then I'm going to have to say that he's my dad's nephew. So, I mean, that kind of gave me reason to believe, because, he did always say that he was related to John Wayne, but you would think that John Wayne's son would have known, you know, unless there was maybe some shenanigans going on before. Who knows with those famous guys like John Wayne, you know?
Yeah, I wonder, because there even in a couple of the articles, there's one Steve Bunce in once. The week he died has an article that I just read, and Jackie Callan had one, and they both mention it, that he was the grandnephew. But yeah, maybe it was because as we get into later in his life, there's a lot of things that were people thought one thing and the another was the truth. It's interesting that is in question as well. Whether or not it was true, it certainly made for good copy, along with the image of him. It was his nickname, the Duke, and he had that look, Hollywood sort of look. He was very good looking. He had blonde hair. He was 6'2", 200 pounds. He got as big as like 220 in some of his fights. 238 to around there. So he's a big guy, muscular. And one of the other things in terms of things are not as they seem sometimes with Tommy Morrison is I learned today that he had pectoral muscle implants. That's something. I guess it's a cosmetic thing that guys can do that.
He did that. I never knew that.
He did that towards the end. Or after he stopped boxing, I don't know, but because that was one of the things that he claimed it was eventually not AIDS that was killing him, that he had a piece of surgical gauze left inside him from an operation to remove one of the pectoral implants. But of course, one of the side effects that he got was this horrible, neurological disease, and that's one of the things is when you have that compromised immune system that goes along with AIDS, the final stages of AIDS, you get a lot of exotic diseases that are out there, but we're all of us are walking around not getting them because our immune systems are stronger,
Right.
So that's one of the things about him is that the things that eventually kill him, it's not AIDS. But I think that's not uncommon for that to happen. Someone who was suffering from AIDS to be killed by something else.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit later as we go through his career.
Sorry.
No. As we go,
I got ahead of myself.
No, it's all right. But I mean, going through his career, because a couple of things. I mean, one of the. I was actually surprised that so many people wanted us to do a blast on Tommy Morrison, and as a matter of fact, I got a caller. I believe it was Alex from Tampa, was kind of pissed off that I wasn't giving Tommy Morrison a lot of credit, and maybe I was being.
Great fight. He has a win over George Foreman.
Well, that fight, you see, but that was a big fight, is arguably his biggest win. But I thought that he lost that fight. I don't even think he won that fight. But anyway. I wasn't the judge, but let's just go back. When he was 13 years old, I mean, Morrison, listen, whether you thought he was a great fighter or not, the thing about Morrison is that he was a typical white tough guy from where he lived, in the South and stuff. He, in Arkansas, where he lived, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Missouri, was where he was living as a kid, and the story goes that by the time he was 13, he was lying about his age and forging paperwork so he could compete in these tough man competitions that apparently, according to Tommy the Duke Morrison, he fought in 50 of them and was 49-1. That's what got him started in boxing. He then became an amateur boxing after the tough man competition, and he fought through the Missouri Golden Glove circuit. And again, according to Morrison, which I couldn't back up, he had an amateur record, which is kind of surprising because I had never thought of Tommy Morrison as an amateur fighter. I mean, he was very crude of a fighter, especially when he started out in his pro career. 222 wins and 20 losses is what Tommy Morrison had claimed to have fought as an amateur. I kind of find that hard to believe. A fighter with 242 amateur fights, I would have thought would have busted onto the scene as a pro a little more refined than Tommy was.
I would absolutely agree, and I think that's what you described is exactly right. I mean, I think that he had those sort of two sort of careers, and there's no doubt about it. In terms of how many bouts they actually were, there's a question mark. But in terms of, there's no doubt about it, it turned him into the bulldog that he was. Because think about this. I think from one of the articles I read, his father was an abusive guy. and he boxed instead of football because of his father. When he had that choice to make, because he had somewhat of a scholarship. In high school he did pretty well, and he was a high school linebacker, and he was going to enroll in Emporia State University, which I guess is in Kansas. He was on a football scholarship, but he chose boxing instead. And he had those two careers. He had, when he was 13, he fought those sort of tough man contests, and who knows how many of those they were, but I'm sure, they were crude. This is a guy who, Bill, he trained with his dad on his front porch. And like you said, this is in the Ozarks, in Arkansas and Oklahoma and stuff like that. It's not surprising that he ended up in the movies, because there was an element about that. Even when he became an amateur later at 17, he started fighting actual amateur bouts. He won a Golden Gloves, and he eventually got to the Olympic trials. But, yeah, somewhere along the lines there, he did get a little bit of fundamentals. And you're right, even as a pro, you could see him still learning. And he fought Ray Mercer in the Olympic trials and lost to him. And then Ray went to, the Seoul Olympics, and ended up winning the gold medal. So when they met as pros, that was a rematch.
Yeah, I loved Ray Mercer. When he won that gold, I thought that he was going to be the best thing since sliced bread, but this isn't about him. This is about Tommy Morrison. On the way up, during the time that Tommy was on his rise, and we did get to see him a lot on TV and stuff, I, like a lot of people of the time, thought he was basically the great white hope. He was, like you mentioned earlier, he was a good-looking guy. He was a white guy, and they were trying to get him the title, and blah, blah, blah. And as he's climbing up, he actually did get some impressive wins over some good fighters, like James Quick Tillis in 1991. He destroyed him in one round. Pinklin Thomas, a former world champion, destroys him in a round. He did fight a couple more fights before he got that shot at Ray Mercer, which really was an interesting fight, because he was winning that fight in the early rounds, but he seemed to really gas out quickly. And as you could look on his resume, this guy was blowing people away in a couple of rounds. He gets in with Ray Mercer, and the ending of that, when he was stopped in 5 rounds, it was kind of a brutal stoppage.
Oh, absolutely. That fight was incredible, and you're right. He was in charge and winning and looking good in those early rounds until Mercer caught him, and wow, it is a terrifying knockout. But you're right. That was one of the things. He did sort of cultivate that great white hope image without really saying it. It was the 80s, and he got into the movie there with Sylvester Stallone, which I'm proud to say I still have never watched, and but that made him a household name to a certain degree. And if you look at his early record, a lot of those knockouts, some of them are, there's quite a few names that were Mike Tyson victims as well. Lorenzo Boyd, Steve Zowski, Dave Jaco, Lorenzo Canaday. These are guys that, all heavyweights that Mike Tyson knocked over. And Pinklin Thomas, James Quick Tillis, well, he went the distance with Mike. But the thing that there was the connection with Tyson was, of course, he was being managed by Bill Caton, who at the time Mike was basically taken away, and he was now with King, and Bill Caton had sort of gotten the Scroogey. Well, not sort of. He had gotten the Scroogey from Don, and Morrison was sort of the replacement. And they were on the trajectory to eventually meet. One of the deals that he signed was like a $38 million deal that was going to be 3 or 4 fights, and the culminating fight would have been against Mike Tyson, and that was where he got that horrible news that he had tested positive for the HIV virus, and that was 1996.
That was the end of that. After his fight with Ray Mercer, to Tommy the Duke's credit, he picked himself back up. He had that comeback victory against Bobby Quarry, and he had some decent wins over some okay fighters, especially in June of 1992. He fought Joe Hipp. Now, Joe Hipp was another guy at the time. You remember that name? Joe Hipp was a very respected fighter, and this was supposed to be a really good matchup. With the winner advancing, the loser maybe taking a step back. And, he went a long time. He ended up stopping Hipp in the 9th round. It was a really good performance, followed by a win, over Marshall Tillman. But more importantly, Carl the Truth Williams. He stopped him in 8 rounds. And Carl the Truth gave Larry Holmes all he could handle. I'll never forget that fight. He gave him all he could handle in that fight. I thought that maybe they rushed Carl a little too much in that fight, but he had a couple of good fights leading up to his second world title shot against George Foreman in 1993.
Yeah, and again, in the Foreman fight, he did look pretty good. Foreman was not, the guy that he, quite the guy that he had been, but I'm pretty sure that it was already after was that before the Alex Stewart fight? I forgot to check that. But it was still a significant win. Yeah, it was after the Alex Stewart fight. And remember, Alex Stewart kind of beat him up. But Tommy Morrison didn't quite do what Alex Stewart did, because Alex Stewart was the one who really got screwed in terms of a decision with Foreman. But like you said, you thought that Foreman even won that fight. It was a close one. But it was after that he really had the really unfortunate upset loss to Michael Bent, who had been a decent amateur, and then he sort of fizzled out. But that was the thing about, I guess it wasn't surprising to some degree, because if you watch that, it's a one-rounder and he gets knocked out. That's what made Tommy fun to watch, was that he was a banger. He fought, he risked. And one of the other things I did want to mention when you said Joe Hipp, it did make me think of like our rankings conversation earlier today, when we were just looking at the crop of heavyweights. I remember back in the 90s thinking, boy, Joe Hipp, wow, what are our heavyweights like today? But now thinking back, it's like, well, yeah, he's pretty decent because he would be, even today, he would be decent. But he was all not the, he's no Jerry Quarry, let's put it that way.
Well, Dax and I were talking later on, and he says, hey, nothing for nothing. He says, I know you, meaning me, he says, I know you don't give a lot of credit, but, the last real decent crop of heavyweights was the Lennox Lewis era. And when you start thinking about some of those guys, Riddick Bowe, Andrew Galata in his prime. I mean, you did have some decent heavyweights, and at the time I was like poo-pooing them, just like we're mentioning about Joe Hipp. But
well, and all of them, you know what I think they have, Bill, that I think that guys
fought each other.
See as much. Well, that too, and I think that we don't see as much, is that real lightning in a bottle type power. Think about the guys that were around then: Morrison, Mercer, Razor Ruddock. These were guys that all had some knockouts that were like scary one-punch type knockouts that you could rattle off, or at least remember if you were a fight fan.
Yeah, but all those fighters...
There wasn't the internet where you could watch the clips.
No, but all those fighters took some chances.
Right.
I mean, that's the nature of this business. You risk getting your head knocked off so that you can take a shot at knocking your opponent's head off. That's what's missing today, Alex. They don't take chances. They, meaning a lot of fighters. They have a different mindset. It's almost like, as much as we made fun of Victor Ortiz for saying no one should have to take a beating like this, and you're like, yeah, nobody if you're a carpenter or a lawyer, but if you're a fighter, that's kind of what's in the job description. Well, that's, as much as I was critical of Victor Ortiz when he said that, it seems that all fighters think that, and it bothers me. But anyway, let's get back. Tommy Morrison, you mentioned Donovan Ruddock after his fall.
That was a great fight. Great fight.
After his fall,
bad stoppage.
This was a fight he lost. He was totally upset by Michael Bennett, in Canada. I'm sorry, from Canada in Oklahoma, in his hometown even. And again, the kid pulls himself back up. And that fight against Donovan Razor Ruddock was a great fight. It actually got him a shot at Lennox Lewis, and ultimately pretty much the end of his career, I think.
Right. And yeah, pretty much. I mean, he did have a couple more fights later, but they were almost as dubious as those tough man bouts he probably had at 13. But I do want to say something about the Donovan Razor Ruddock fight. I watched that again today, and what a great fight that really is. However, I did want to mention, because I'm pretty sure, I know that you guys, you and Dax have talked about him quite a bit, and I'm pretty sure he's a listener to the show. I'm going to be critical, too, but what was interesting about that fight was that it was kind of a quick stoppage from Ron Lipton, and the feed I watched was with Pedro Fernandez and Bert Sugar doing the commentary. It was sort of an interesting pairing. I think it was like an international feed or something, because I'm pretty sure HBO probably did the actual live broadcast. I think that's on YouTube as well. But in this feed, Pedro Fernandez and Bert Sugar were quite explicit in how much of a quick stoppage they thought it was. What was interesting to me was that it did seem that Lipton called a knockdown on Razor Ruddock when his back just sort of touched the ropes, and the ropes weren't really holding him up. I will post that in social media because that's a fight that's pretty interesting. And if he does listen to the show, maybe he'll shoot you an email or something, because I do see him active on social media a lot. So I do think it was interesting, because when you watch the fight, I mean, I don't want to go so far as to say, yeah, to me, it's a quick stoppage, but I definitely think that Ruddock was in trouble. But it's a hell of a fight.
Considering that Razor Ruddock has a back like a sheet of plywood, and that he fought Mike Tyson twice, I could see your point 100%. Tommy Morrison, you know, before we get into the dark side of him right now, you know, what I liked about Tommy Morrison was something you said earlier. This guy was a banger, and he wasn't afraid to get in there and fight. He had beautiful left hook. Left hook to the body was probably one of the best punches of his era. You know, he was able to go in, but again, to me, he was never a polished fighter. He never really used his jab like he could have, although he knocked out a fighter in the first round with just one punch, and it was a jab. But I think Tommy Morrison, you know, was in the right place at the right time and was tough enough, was a tough guy, and he was successful. After his fight with Lennox Lewis, he was scheduled to fight again in February of 1996 against Arthur Weathers, and that's when a routine the blood work in Vegas turned up as HIV positive, and that fight was canceled. This is when it all starts getting crazy, because although he clearly was not the same mentally, 20 years later, after that fight, and he came back in November of that same year and fought Marcus Road in Japan, claiming that HIV cannot be spread, or it can't be tested. You can't test, or whatever his claim was at that time. And he actually got to fight Marcus Road in 1996, which would be his last fight for 11 years before he tried to make his comeback. Yeah, and he did have one other one. I think in 2007 he had one in West Virginia, and there was one in Mexico. But both of those, I read one article saying that the West Virginia one looked kind of shady. Well, there was another one that doesn't show up that he had in Wyoming, where he actually fought the promoter of the event, and it was in Wyoming. You remember that? Yeah, that one was the most recent. That one was after that Mexico one in 2008, and then he fought in Wyoming, and then he went and did the MMA thing. But that fight wasn't sanctioned or anything. I think that's why it doesn't show up under BoxRec. But his claim was that you can't get HIV in the ring, and this is where it really gets a little confusing because after that he also got arrested for drunk driving and did some time, and it gets a little cloudy of what was going on with this guy, how he got it, where he got it, if he had it. It's kind of crazy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it was really catastrophic news to learn that he was HIV positive. And remember, this is 1996. Magic Johnson had recently tested positive. It wasn't too long ago, previous to this. It was actually at Magic. Remember, he got so much better from the treatments that he was taking that he made a comeback. He talked to Morrison at one point and tried to convince him to go ahead and get treatment. But Tommy became very much in denial about it, and like you said, he believes that he said crazy things like it couldn't be transferred, you couldn't detect the virus, all kinds of whacked out things. There's a really good article I read by this guy named Drew Gibson that I read. He had a couple of things. One of the things that's sad.
Wait, hey, Alex, just hold that thought about the article. I got to take a break here for ESPN New Hampshire, so let's take a quick break. Hold the thought about the article, and then when we come back, we can pick up with that and some of the crazy stuff that he did say towards the end. It went from a fighter that had a lot of promise and that was loved to pretty crazy stuff. So hold that thought. We'll be back in 2.
Talking Boxing with Billy C. Every week, 2 hours of the best boxing talk on the radio.
I have a bunch of questions, Donnell, right? If you feel like you want to, you can answer for JD first. Why will you win? JD Chapman, why will you win?
Baby Holmes will get sick and get hit by a train that day on the way to the fight, or he might have diarrhea, he might have the flu, he might throw up. One of his eyeballs might fall out that day, and I might get lucky.
Talking Boxing
with Billy C. If you want your voice heard on Talkin' Boxing with Billy C., then call our hotline at 845-228-8710. Leave a voicemail, or you could just tell Billy C. that you like his mustache.
Should I ask you your opinion about this idea?
I'm just trying to give you the encouragement.
Listen, all I need from you is to make sure you don't hang up on people.
And if we like your call, we'll play it back on the air.
You have the knowledge and wisdom of boxing because of what you do and how well you do it.
Leave your name, hometown, and what you think of the show. 845-228-8710. We want to hear you.
Hey, fight fans, check out KOFantasyBoxing.com. KO Fantasy Boxing is boxing's only trademarked fantasy game. Check it out, www.KOFantasyBoxing.com. Select your own gym, your own fighters, track them through a season that can last from 3 months to a year, depending upon which league you join. You got to check this out, man. www.KOFantasyBoxing.com. Join it today. Again, www.KOFantasyBoxing.com. And tell them Billy C. sent ya.
Now back to Talkin' Boxing with Billy C.
And we're back. You're listening to the Talkin' Boxing with Billy C. show. We're in the middle of our blast from the past. I'm joined here with my man Alex Papali, and we're talking about Tommy the Duke Morrison. And Alex, just before I went to break, you were going to tell us about an article that I so abruptly interrupted you on.
Oh, no problem. I'm sorry. I should have noticed the time.
You're damn right. You should have noticed the time, Papali. Come on, man. You know the deal.
No, I saw there's a website. Just the article. I'll post the link to it. An article by a guy named Drew Gibson that goes into a lot of this stuff about the disease and what treatment he, might have tried to take and what he decided not to take. But yeah, things got very weird. Remember, in the 90s, there still was a tremendous stigma about getting AIDS. The ways you could get it, most especially for a guy like a big macho heterosexual sex symbol like Tommy Morrison, the idea that he could have gotten it from gay sex was, of course, something that he had to it stigmatized him. I mean, if he would use the equipment in the gym, people didn't want to use it because he would sweat on it. People in his towns where he lived would cross the street when they saw him. They didn't want to shake his hand. So he faced a lot of things all the other people suffering from AIDS or became HIV positive suffered as well. It's very likely he got it from heterosexual sex. He at one point, one of his trainers called him a bimbo magnet. When he was 14, and I mentioned he had an abusive father, when he was 14, his father took him to a strip club and saw to it that he lost his virginity there. So I think that, he had quite a few sexual partners in his life, and maybe that's how it happened. The other rumor was that it was linked to steroids, but whatever it was, he did have it. He believed he had cured himself of it or that it was a false positive, but of course, no, he never took another test to prove it. And I think that's where all the denial starts, because like you mentioned, then the DUIs come. He was devastated. Think about this. This is a guy who had the potential to make $30 million. The contract that Arthur Weathers fight was that was the first fight of a contract that would have eventually led to a fight with Tyson and made him $30 million. So he was crushed, the idea that his career was over, and it did create a spiral, and that's where drug use came in. And yeah, I think we're talking exotic stuff, because if not heroin, maybe worse, because I remember you had one show where you interviewed someone who had an interesting story that did suggest he was smoking something, whether it was crack or meth or something, but he definitely seemed delusional in things he said, and it was just a downward spiral. He never took any treatment. Or at least until the end. People didn't even know where he was at times.
Magic Johnson is still a big question mark, when you talk about HIV. I mean, the guy looks phenomenal to this day. He claims he was cured from some treatments that he underwent in Europe that we didn't have available here. And I think when he met with Tommy Morrison, he was trying to get him to do that. But Morrison, and first of all, how he got the AIDS or HIV is a mystery. However, he was a drinker, and there was many a times he would wake up not remembering anything. So who knows who he was with or anything like that, or even worse, if he was doing drugs that could have passed the HIV virus to him. But regardless of how he got it, the blood test proved that he did, and he started these crazy claims that it was the government was out to get him, and it was a conspiracy with the government to get him personally, and that then he went as far at one point to say that the government AIDS doesn't exist, that the government made it all up, and all of this stuff, and in the middle of all of that, he had reached out to me. And I met him. Actually, both he started this with one girlfriend and ended up leaving her and finding another one who picked up the cause. And they had all of this documentation, and I had him on the show. As a matter of fact, an interview was up under the hot interview section on BillyCBoxing.com, and I tried to let him be use our show to help spread whatever his thoughts were, but it became pretty obvious, Alex, that he was not mentally sound, and some of the things that he was saying were, as Mike Tyson would say, ludicrous, because they really were, and I think the thing that really pointed it out was in 2011. He was supposed to fight in Canada, okay? And this was after the Wyoming fight, and of course after the fight in Mexico and all of that stuff. And he had tried to fight in other places, and nobody would let him. And like you had alluded to earlier, he would come in with blood results under his arm. Here you go. Here's the results. And they're like, no, you don't understand. We got to take it. And he refused to do it. Didn't want to get stuck. Didn't believe that they were going to give him a fair test. And he even said on my show, if you listen to the interview, that he has no problem giving a blood test, but he's not 100% sure about how to test, if they're accurate, blah, all this crazy stuff. But I think that the kicker was in February of 2011, he was all ready to fight in Montreal. And for some reason, he thought that the Canadian Commission wasn't going to press him for blood work. And that was totally wrong. And he tried to give him, he tried to bring those positive, or I should say negative results, and hand them to the commission. The commission refused it. He refused to take them in front of the doctor at the commission's office, and he said, "We'll take this dog and pony show somewhere else." Now, when he made that statement, and I know it's out there and stuff, to me, that was kind of a subliminal message that maybe he did know in a way that he was out there. Maybe that was the last little trace of normalcy that we heard out of Tommy Morrison's mouth.
Wow. Yeah.
And and another thing is, there was an article about him. I forget which one. I used to know the year and the month. ESPN, the mag, had, when he admitted, this was early on, when he admitted that he had the HIV and he was going to do everything he could and blah, blah, blah. And then, a decade later, he denies that he ever had the interview, and it's like, it's in the ESPN, the mag, I think when it was all said and done, you were there at the Hall of Fame when he and Riddick Bowe were standing up and saying that they were both wanting to make a comeback to save boxing and all of that stuff. And, I just, at that point, I knew that this guy was not mentally there. And the story you alluded to about him doing drugs, yes, in a very bad section of where he was trying to start a gym and where he was living, and in Nebraska, it was just it was a really bad downfall, and I think it all came into focus in just before he died in August of 2013. Tommy Morrison's mother did an interview with ESPN, and she said, "Listen, he's got full-blown AIDS. He's too far gone, mentally and physical. He's in the end of his life stage. That's it." This is his mother saying this, and meanwhile, he's saying that he's got some other disease that has nothing to do with AIDS.
Right, yeah, and that's where it's really sad, because, and we see, and like your book, I mean, this is not something new. We've seen these self-destructive spirals that fighters end up in. This one, of course, is not as much a result of boxing. I mean, you'd have to, I'm sure the blows to the head didn't help anything, but let's face it, this is an addict destroying himself and telling lies to himself, most of all, first and foremost to himself, and to everyone in the world around him, in his world around him. And as you can see, there's only a few close people that take up his cause. If you talk to his wife, like ESPN did, there's quotes from her, because he was with a woman named Tricia Morrison when he died. She still was saying, no, he just has this infection. It's like he's dying of pneumonia. And technically, I guess his death certificate does not say AIDS, but I think, again, like I was saying, that sometimes that happens, that if pneumonia killed you, but it was AIDS that made you so weak that pneumonia could kill you.
Well, Tricia...
And years of deterioration. But I think the other thing is that that's the sadder thing, is that this is not the sort of death spiral we see in some great fighters and tragic fighters. This is what addiction does to people, and that's really sad. And it certainly is a result from learning that you can't do what you're best at, and that's box. You can't do it anymore because you're sick. And instead of taking care of himself, he destroyed himself.
Trish, I don't know why I don't know if they ever actually got married. Maybe at the very, very end. But that's why she had him cremated so quick. She did not want anybody to be able to say he had AIDS, even though everybody knows that he had AIDS. But hey, listen, unfortunately, I think for Tommy Morrison, that's what people are always going to think. That battle with AIDS, in my opinion, the loss of his mind, and I think that. When push comes to shove, in his prime prior to the HIV, he was a damn good fighter. At least he was fun to watch, like you alluded to. Is he a world champion in today's standards? I think he's a little small by some of the heavyweights today, but I think that there would be a very good chance that he could have beaten guys that are out there today. That are in the mix for titles. So, Tommy the Duke Morrison, to this day, I still believe he had one of the best hooks. Like you said, left hook to the body was good. I think his biggest weakness was his chin. And I think that failed him in every one of his losses, basically, except the loss the mighty loss that took his life. So, Tommy the Duke Morrison, who did you put him in?
And also, I think the other thing is, maybe, like you said earlier, is that some of the fundamentals he was just lacking. But the chin, that's what made him so dramatic. Was when that chin gave out, it gave out.
Yes.
I put him in against Vlad Klitschko, Deontay Wilder, and Alexander Povetkin. And interestingly, he matches up best with Povetkin, and boy, it makes me want to wish I could see those fights. We'll do Vlad first. I had them fight one time, and in the first matchup, Vlad wins a split decision. He was dropped. Vlad was on the canvas in the 7th. He put Morrison down twice in the 8th. He wins a unanimous decision, 116 to 109 and 115 to 111. Against one judge had it 113 to 112 in favor of Morrison. When they fight 100 times, Vlad dominates. Morrison wins 13, loses 87. All 13 of his wins come by the KO. And of Vlad's 87 victories, he stops Tommy Morrison a whopping 67 times. Against Deontay Wilder, he does rarely well, and he stopped Wilder in 5 rounds, TKO at 1 minute and 37 of the 5th. When they fight 100 times, Morrison dominates, 73 wins, 24 defeats, 3 draws, 64 times he stops Wilder, and of Wilder's 24 wins, 23 were by way of stoppage. And finally, against Alexander Povetkin, he matches up the best. When they fought the first time, Morrison wins by 7th round TKO at 2 minutes and 54 seconds of the 7th. When they go 100 times, Morrison Morrison gets just slightly worse of it. 46 wins, 47 losses, 7 draws. Of those 46 wins, he had 29 knockouts, and of Povetkin's 47 wins, he had 22 knockouts.
I could see those fights being the toughest because they're very similar in style and size and build and everything.
Size, definitely.
So great job as usual, Alex. Tommy the Duke Morrison, former world heavyweight champion. He had a career record 48 wins, 42 by knockout. He lost 3 times in his career, being stopped all 3 times. He had 1 draw. Now, he fought 172 rounds of his 52 fights with an 81% knockout ratio. So if you think I'm not giving him the credit he deserves, I think the stats speak for themselves. He was a good fighter, and like Alex just told you, the outcome of the title bout championship computer game, the simulations, he did pretty well with those. So Tommy the Duke Morrison, our blast from the past today, and Alex, as usual, a great job with that. Hey, we're